Okay, hello everyone. This is going to be a short 10-minute conceptual overview of some of the stuff that we've been talking about over the last couple of weeks, minus consumer and producer surplus and government interventions in the economy. The reason why I wanted to offer this overview is because I know a lot of people are coming back from being away for a while, and they're back in the classroom, and they feel a little bit lost or uneasy about some of the terms that we're using in class. And so let me just emphasize, there is going to be some formulas in this video. I don't want to take up a lot of time, so I'm not going to actually calculate stuff like price elasticity of demand or price elasticity of supply. That can be found in a separate YouTube video, or I can provide YouTube videos to support you. But generally, I want to be talking about supply and demand and elasticities in kind of like a very broad, general way to kind of help you get up to speed. Okay? And so we're also using the opioid epidemic to better understand. We're using this social problem. We're going to return to this next week to better understand economics, and in the hopes that we actually use economics to kind of solve pressing social problems like this. Today I also talked a little bit, very briefly, about the affordable housing crisis. This is a good book as well, Evicted. And again, we can use economics to sort of solve these very pressing social problems and also learn more economics. So the first role, the start of this unit, I introduced this paradox called the water-diamond paradox, where I asked you to think about why is it that water, which is so much more essential to life, is so much cheaper than diamonds, which are essentially irrelevant to life. You obviously do not need a diamond to survive. And then a lot of you came up with different answers. You were talking about the fact that diamonds are more scarce than water. You were talking about the production of diamonds is probably more expensive. That like the production process to find diamonds is probably more expensive. That water is more abundant. And all of these explanations can really be boiled down into two factors, which are supply and demand. So all of the reasoning and rationale that you gave is correct, but we can actually say that the reason why diamonds are priced significantly higher than water relates to the law of supply and the law of demand. And so this I'm going to skip over just very briefly, but we built this model, this simple supply and demand model, and we talked and explained. We first started with the demand curve. And so the law of demand says something very intuitive. As the price of a good goes up, the quantity demanded, which I'll abbreviate as QD, should go down. It should fall. Now, this law of demand we can represent graphically with a downward sloping demand curve. I'm going to use words like curves in economics, even though I might just draw the demand curve as a straight line, because for just like, in higher levels of economics, we would work with curves more frequently, but because since this course doesn't require knowledge of calculus, we work more with straight lines than curves. Okay? And so we can see right here is a downward sloping demand curve, and we can see that there's what is called an inverse relationship, right, which is essential that might actually appear on your exam. There's an inverse relationship between price and the quantity demanded, in this case of ice cream cones. Now, it's important to note, why does this happen? So there are three explanations for why the demand curve is downward sloping. The first one is my favorite, which is the law of diminishing, well, not my favorite, but the first one is really important, which is the law of diminishing marginal utility. And the idea behind this is I played an Olivia Rodrigo song, and the first time I played it, people were excited to hear it. Some people weren't, because everybody has different utility functions. What is utility? Utility is a measure of sort of happiness or benefit we get from consumption of a good, right? And so the idea or the power of the law of diminishing marginal utility, in this course we're going to say that we're assuming that utility is going to diminish at the margin. And so what this means is that the additional utility you get from an additional unit or good or service is going to diminish. So, for example, that first time I heard Olivia Rodrigo's driver's license, I was very excited to hear it. That second time, I still liked hearing it, but a little bit less. That third time, still liked hearing it, a little bit less, and less and less. And so that has an effect that creates a downward sloping demand curve. That mechanism alone helps explain a downward sloping demand curve because if you think about it, that first ice cream cone, I might value it at $3. But that second ice cream cone, right, I already had the taste in my mouth, I'm okay. I might value it a little less. I'm not willing to pay more than $2.50 for it. Well, since a market demand curve is just the sum of a bunch of individual demand curves, this idea, this psychological idea, or this law of diminishing marginal utility helps explain why we might end up with a downward sloping demand curve. Okay? Then we're going to move on. This second effect is the substitution effect, which is this idea as the price of a good goes up, you might actually try to find a substitute, right, or a close substitute. So for example, the price of ice cream goes up, you might go to the yogurt market. And the final one is the income effect, which is this idea, if the price of a good or service goes up, you run out of money, that your income becomes smaller, and you have less money to spend on purchasing an additional unit of that good. Okay? So those are the three mechanisms for explaining a downward sloping demand curve. Really, what you really need to understand is that the law of demand is that price goes up, quantity demanded falls, and we represent that graphically in a simple supply and demand graph with P on the y-axis, Q on the x-axis, and a downward sloping demand curve right here. Okay? Now let's move on. Now here I want to draw a distinction between two important factors. Or actually, no, I'm actually going to switch this around a little bit, and let's go ahead and talk about the law of supply. So the law of supply is that as price goes up, the quantity supplied in the market will also go up. And the reasoning, and here I'm going to take another color for this, is a little bit more complicated, right? So in Unit 3, when we get into producer theory, we're going to explain why this law actually happens. And it relates to the fact that firms, we're assuming in the short run, in certain types of markets, face increasing marginal costs. That's a very advanced explanation, and we'll get to that point eventually, but we don't have the tools yet. But for right now, it's helpful just to think about it for a moment. If a firm's total revenue is just a function of price times quantity, as a firm, as a business, as a supplier, you want a higher price as you produce more and more output, right? That's going to be better for you, and you're more willing to produce at that higher price, right? Because if you're just producing a good or service over and over again, your opportunity cost might grow. And so to compensate you for that increasing opportunity cost, for the fact that you could be doing something else as opposed to producing solely one good, you might demand a higher price. Now, if that's a little bit complicated for us right now, it might be because we don't have the tools yet. Just know that the law of supply says as the price goes up, the quantity supplied goes up. And now I want to introduce this distinction between quantity demanded and change in demand, and quantity supplied and change in supply. And so specifically, let me move this a little bit closer. When we think about a movement along the demand curve, or change in quantity demanded, or when we think about changing demand or changing supply, what we're really doing is we're going to shift the supply curve either to the left or shift the supply curve to the right, or shift the demand curve to the left or shift the demand curve to the right. And so things that can shift demand, or let me put it this way. If we say demand increases, or supply increases, we're going to shift the curve to the right. If we say demand or supply decreases, we're going to shift the curve to the left. And this is a very, very important point, right? This is going to help us. Before I introduced this idea of shifts, I talked about movement along the demand and supply curves. But I'm introducing this out of order because I think I want to make this video a little bit more compressed, and so we can actually see movement if we shift. Let me shift a couple of the curves. And so let's imagine that this is a market for lemonade. And we have a downward sloping demand curve and an upward sloping supply curve. And from this downward sloping demand curve and supply curve, what we would do to find the equilibrium price, to find the price assuming that we leave the market alone, that there's no government intervention, no outside government intervention and stuff like that. We go at this intersection, and this will be P star. This is the equilibrium price. And the equilibrium quantity, which represents both the quantity supplied and quantity demanded, because we're assuming when the market is in equilibrium, when it's in balance, and we leave the market alone, that quantity supplied and quantity demanded will be equal. Right, so there are stuff that can happen that can shift the demand curve and shift the supply curve. And so, for example, something that can happen to shift the demand curve would be, there would be a hot summer's day, right? An unexpectedly hot day. And we would expect the demand curve to shift to the right. And then we can tell a story with this simple graphical model by just going at this new intersection between demand and supply and labeling it P2. And then going down from this new intersection of demand and supply and labeling it Q2. And what the story we can tell with this, and I'll explain why this is so, is that if demand were to shift to the right, because it's a hot summer's day, then the price will go up and the quantity demanded and supplied in the market will also go up. Now, it's important to note that the demand curve shifted and the supply curve stayed the same. But there's movement happening along the supply curve, meaning the demand curve shifting to the right increases the price. And now more suppliers are willing to supply at the higher price because this is what the supply curve is telling us, and they enter the market. And so there's actually movement happening along the supply curve. And that's really, really cool. It's a cool idea because it's essentially like the market with all these individual actors, producers and consumers, is sort of engaged in this coordinated dance. Or you can imagine Mozart or Beethoven playing in the background as this is taking place. And so this helps me introduce the distinction between movement along a curve, which we see here. There's movement along the supply curve, but the supply curve stays the same, and the shifting of a curve. We can see the demand curve shifts. Now, of course, there can be multiple shifts that happen in a specific scenario. So we can also imagine a situation, and for whatever reason, that the supply curve shifts to the left. Let's say a couple of ice cream trucks have a malfunction, and so the supply curve would shift to the left, reflecting a decrease in supply. And what this means, right, when the curve moves, this curve shifting to the left shows that suppliers are going to demand a higher price at every single quantity that they could potentially produce. And this relates to the fact that they're facing some external cost, right? Something external to this relationship between price and quantity that is impacting them, and they're going to demand a higher price. And we can see what this does, right? Shifting from S1 to S2 increases price further, right? So the demand increased price. Now the shifting of the supply curve due to the ice cream truck malfunctions shifts the supply curve to the left. And honestly, it's kind of indeterminate where the quantity supplied and demanded in the market will end up, because it just depends on the magnitude of the shift. And we can also see, again, movement along the demand curve. So we see as the supply curve is shifting left, the quantity demanded is naturally going to fall because effectively the price is increasing, right? And so we see the movement along the demand curve. And this helps me introduce the distinction between movements and shifts. Movements along the demand curve. If we say that there's going to be an increase in price, right? Movements along the demand curve or movements along the supply curve results from increases in price. But price alone, right, the price of a good is not going to shift the curve, right? Because we already have that relationship mapped out between demand and supply. It has to be something external to the relationship. It has to be something external to this graphical representation, right? Maybe a war, a famine, this belief that ice cream, or lemonade in this case, cures cancer. so on and so forth. Oh, I messed up. I said market for lemonade at the beginning, but I guess I switched to market for ice cream. All those things that are external to it, to this graphical representation, or this relationship between price and quantity, that's what's going to shift the curves. Now I'm going to put a list in the description of this YouTube video of shifters of supply and shifters of demand, and I would like you to take notes on all those things. That's going to be part of your assignment. Finally, the last thing that we studied in this class before you guys came back was this thing called elasticities. And so elasticities are pretty interesting because they measure sensitivity to changes in price, which is important as well. Because sometimes when the price goes up, although the law of demand, for example, predicts that the quantity demanded of that good or service should fall, we want to know how sensitive or by how much, what's the magnitude. Because that's important for not only businesses to understand, not only for consumers to understand, but also for policymakers to understand as well. People that are potentially in governmental jobs that might want to regulate some of these industries. And so I gave you the example of Martin Shkreli raising the price of a life-saving drug, Daraprim, by 400%, right? And a lot of you, rightly guessed that the reason why he was able to do that is because there wasn't going to be a lot of people that left that market for that life-saving drug because they would die. And that's, kind of an extreme example of someone exploiting the fact that there is inelastic demand for Daraprim. And so elasticities, I'm going to pause here because I think I have a YouTube video on elasticities, on price elasticity of demand, price elasticity of supply, and income elasticity of demand, and cross-price elasticity of demand, which are the ones that you have to know. And so I'm going to go ahead and pause here and just direct you to that YouTube video in the description. All right, we are done.